My sister and I, well, I have to go further. As you know, my dad had 3 city lots. From the corner, there was an empty lot and an empty lot, and then his lot had the house on the front end, of course, and at the back we had the barn where we kept 2 cows, and then part of the backyard was fenced in for the chickens, and we had some guinea hens that were an African fowl bird, a wild fowl bird, but they were domesticated and we had them. And we had the 2 cows to get milk, to sell and make butter from the cream and sell the butter. Butter. You English people think of butter. I say butter for some reason. And we would grow on those 2 other lots that were no buildings on them. We tilled them every spring. We paid a man with horses to plow them up, and we grew both lots into potatoes, or with potatoes. And then we had a little wooden wagon, and I remember the wheels were wooden spoke wheels, and they had an iron rim around them, and the handle was wooden with a little metal thing where you could pull it. And we called them, the actual name was Buster Brown wagons. And my sister and I don't know her age and I don't know my age, but my sister was about 4 years older than I. And her and I that was routine. We would put a sack of potatoes on the Buster Brown wagon, and we would start off from our home, 103rd Street, to 101st Street, and then on 101st Street, we would go from 118th Avenue to 100 Avenue. So that's 18 blocks south, and right into the center of downtown Edmonton. And in Edmonton in those days, all laborers and so forth, there were an abundance of restaurants, and they were all operated by Chinese people, and the Chinese were the people that were left over when they were building the railroads through the mountains. Anyhow, Julia and I would pull a wagon of potatoes to a restaurant, and that restaurant would say, no, I'm not interested in buying the sack of potatoes, I got enough. And I'm paraphrasing all the words that were being used. And so we would go to the next restaurant, and I'll combine the various things that happened into one trip. The Chinaman at the back, we would go down the back alley where the entrance to the kitchen was. And the Chinese restaurant, we called them chinks in those days, of course. And this Chinese guy would come out and take the sack of potatoes, and we had them closed at one end, and he would open them, or we would help him open them or what, and he would take a potato out, take his knife, cut it in half, and say, oh no, too watery, or potatoes are too watery. But he wouldn't throw the 2 halves back in the sack, he would throw them in his doorstep of the restaurant. And maybe he would take a second potato, do the same thing. And he wouldn't buy the sack of potatoes for 50 cents. So we'd go to another restaurant, and of course we were watching very much the sun, because we didn't have watches in those days, so we would watch the sun to see what time it was, because we had to get back home, and we had to sell the potatoes before we got back home. So finally we'd find a restaurant that would buy the potatoes, but by this time several restaurants had used this cutting the potato open stunt, and the sack of potatoes might be a little bit low. So the guy that's buying the potatoes, he would say, well, you want 50 cents for the sack of potatoes, but it's not full, so I'll give you 30 cents, or 40 cents, or 45, a lesser amount. And so Julia and I would take a lesser amount, knowing that we would get hell from my father for not bringing 50 cents. And we would go home. And then another day my sister would be crying her head off that she didn't want to go selling potatoes anymore. And of course, I was a very young kid at the time, and I didn't understand why my sister didn't want to go to sell potatoes, because as we were selling these potatoes, the Chinese guys, I learned this later of course, and the Chinese guys all wanted to give her a little field. And so she was very reluctant all the time to go and sell potatoes. And of course my dad, I guess in those days you didn't discuss anything sexual with your parents, and we certainly didn't at home. And I guess, but my sister told me in later years about why she didn't want to sell the potatoes. And that's about all I want to tell you, or can tell you about the potatoes. And a curious thing, one year, the Ukrainians are very keen, as you might or might not know, but the Ukrainians use, and even for Christmas, the main dish is wheat and poppy seed. So the Ukrainians are great for growing poppy seed. And we make a dish where we take a stoneware bowl. Stoneware bowls are rough. And then we take a stick similar to a baseball bat, and we hammer the wheat in the stoneware bowl. And the chaff, that's the outer skin of the wheat kernels then come out kind of lighter colored, and then they take the bowl and put a bed sheet on the snow outside, and the wind is blowing, and they take the bowl of wheat that's been pounded. The chaff now has to be removed. So they take the wheat and they pour it onto the sheet on the snow, bed sheet on the snow, and the wind blows the chaff away. And you can't do it right away. You've got to wait until the chaff dries in the bowl. And they mixed that pounded wheat so that the chaff would be exposed to dry. And then I remember my stepmother out there with the sheet on the snow, pouring the wheat on the sheet, and the wind was blowing the chaff away. And then they would take that wheat without the chaff, put it in the bowl, and you boiled it until the kernels were all broken. And at the meantime, you would also, this is the main Christmas Ukrainian dish, and boil the wheat and honey, lots of honey, if you could afford to get it. Now, we used to raid honeybees' hives in the forest, and we knew about bee stings and all that, but we didn't have any protection, but we knew how to handle it because we had little smoke chimney pot. And we would steal honey sometimes from the bees. Well, we didn't consider it stealing. Stealing wasn't used. That was the way it was done. It was as normal as walking. And we would get some extra honey that way, and then we would sell butter and buy some honey, and sell some milk and buy a little honey possibly. And so the wheat and the honey and the poppy seed was boiled. The poppy seed was soaked the day previous overnight, so it kind of softened. And then we had this kind of mush. And the wheat kernels were semi-dissolved, but you didn't want them to dissolve completely like flour. It was still wheat kernels, and poppy and honey. And in the Orthodox religion, which I was brought up in, Christmas Day is practically nothing day, but Christmas Eve is the big, big thing. But you must have 12 dishes, or 12 different courses, but not courses, 12 different foods. But no meat. Now, can you imagine? We're very poor. So you've got to invent what you're going to do to get 12 dishes. Oh, and this kucha is this wheat. The name of it in Ukrainian is kucha. And it was wheat, poppy, and honey, and thick. And it was very customary, not customary, that was the proper way to do it. You had to take, my dad would take a teaspoon and take a a tip on the teaspoon of this kucha, that's Christmas Eve, and he would trigger it like that, and it would fly and hit the ceiling and stick. And that had to be done. That was a Christmas thing. Same as caroling, as we had caroling at Christmas Eve, of course. And caroling was, and this bit on the ceiling. And the other thing is, we went out and got some straw and put the straw underneath the table, so when we sat around the table eating the 12 different foods, we were like the straw was symbolic of the manger that Jesus was born in. And the wheat to the ceiling was something I give to the gods. And the Indians in St. Albert and that, they used to catch pike or jackfish, as we called them up there. We didn't use the word pike, but pike and jackfish are the same fish. So the Indians would come around house to house with a sleigh selling frozen wintertime. Of course, it's Christmas, and Edmonton is cold in winter. And if my dad had enough money, which he always managed to save somehow, I can't remember ever a Christmas that we didn't have a jackfish. So fish was one dish, the wheat thing was a second dish, and some boiled eggs were another dish, and cornmeal. Cornmeal is powdered, not dust, but powdered like sand. Popcorn that you make, but not popcorn, the kernels. And that's, you can buy it in England or anywhere else, I think. And that's called cornmeal. It's yellow. And it's like yellow sand. And you boil that. And we would boil it like porridge or whatever or cream of wheat that a lot of people eat nowadays even. Cream of wheat is the same type of kernel, but it's white, and it's made from wheat. But we had cornmeal, yellow, made from corn. And we would have cornmeal, but I can't remember. Oh yeah, and sometimes we were lucky, we could have fish, so we had the jackfish, and then we had some pickled herring sometimes. You know, the Jewish people have a lot of pickled herring. Sometimes we have pickled herring, but I can't remember exactly all the other dishes. Oh, we had a bowl of sauerkraut. Sauerkraut, yes, sauerkraut. That's the one thing that I always hated, and to this day I hate sauerkraut. Oh, and cottage cheese, of course, and we could eat bread and butter, of course. But 12 different things had to be on the table for this Christmas Eve. And with the little bit of kucha up on the ceiling and the straw underneath the table, and that was our big Christmas dinner. And my father, have you got some more tape there? And I told you, I'll tell you again, my father was a very smart man, even though he beat me a lot. But my father, sometimes, or nearly most of the time, at Christmas time could manage to buy a bag of peanuts in the shell, like you have up on the counter there. And me being the oldest, I always had, but Julia, I can't remember Julia ever being involved in what I'm going to tell you, because I think Julia was now working someplace. My dad would say to me, okay, Victor, or Victor, because my name was Ukrainian. I was never called at home Victor, it was always Victor. And Frank was Franik, and Lloyd was Ludwig. And he'd say, Victor, and I would be told to put 3 piles of peanuts. But the piles had to be not too big, so my dad could cup his hand over the piles. And I would make the 3 piles extremely equal. I would practically individually weigh each peanut as I was putting it on a pile. There was a main reason for that, because when the 3 piles were complete and identical, then my dad would say, Franik, the youngest son, you can have first choice. And then Lloyd would have second choice of the piles. And I would have to take the pile that was left. So naturally you can understand why I would make the 3 piles equal. Another thing about 3, in winter time, my dad, I think nearly every winter, somehow or other, we had an apple box full of apples from British Columbia. And they were kept in our cellar under the house. And to get into the cellar, there was a square trap door in our kitchen, cut right through the linoleum and wood and everything. And then there was a flat surface ring that when it went down, it was flat. You could walk on it. Some safes or some trunks are made that way. And if you wanted to go in the cellar, you had to take this ring, lift the trap door up, it was hinged, and there were stairs, or wooden, like a ladder, but it had flat steps on it. And we would go into, I would be told to go into the cellar and bring 3 apples. One for Frank, one for Lloyd, and one for me. Nowadays, when they sell apples, they're all the same size because they're graded at the orchards or wherever when they're packed. But in those days, the apples used to come what we called orchard run. So a box would have big apples in it and little apples, or a mixture of various sizes. And the apples in those days were all individually wrapped. Oranges were the same thing. That was the custom in those days. Every apple was wrapped with a thin sheet of paper. It was a kind of a special kind of paper. And when we took the paper off the apples, we had outdoor plumbing, of course. The toilet was out down at the end of the yard where the cows were. So, and paper, of course, to buy toilet paper was very, well, we didn't buy, I never bought toilet paper. We used Eaton's catalogs, and, so forth. And these apple papers we used out in the toilet. So I would go in the cellar, and I would make sure that I took the paper off and I looked at the apples very carefully, and I brought up 3 identical apples in size, because then I would have to put the 3 apples on the table, and Frank would get first choice, Lloyd would get second choice, and I would have to get the apple left over. So if I brought 3 medium-sized apples, they all had to be 3 mediums, or 3 large, or 3 small. Well, naturally, being a kid and greedy, when we opened the box, the first 3 I brought up would be naturally 3 big ones. And as the box got smaller, I would be bringing 3 mediums, and then I would be bringing 3 small. And then the box would be empty. And that's a little thing. And if we got Christmas presents, we understood about Christmas stockings, and we used to put our socks. Socks were a premium, but we used to put a sock out there, my dad or my stepmother, whatever, but in the morning we would get up and there might be, do you know what kiss candy is? They're candy, like a taffy candy, and they're wrapped in paper with twist on each end. Those are called in Canada kisses. I don't know in England what they're called, but we called them kiss candy. And so we would reach into the sock, and we would often find what we nowadays they call the mandarin oranges, because it's politically correct to say mandarin rather than Jap for Japanese, but we called them Jap oranges. And we would find a Jap orange in the sock, and 2 or 3 or 4 or half a dozen kisses, and always we found a piece of coal in the sock. And the coal was to remind us that we were bad throughout the year, and that was our gift for being bad. And we would get sometimes, sometimes I can't remember completely, but a few peanuts in a sack, a few kisses, a Jap oranges was a real novelty. And remember, this is before I was working in a fruit store, because when I was working in a fruit store, any fruit that had a rotten spot on it or anything, I always brought home, and we just cut the rotten orange in half, and the other half was good. We do that even today. And so But when we were little kids, an orange was really something. And that's why I can sympathize, like after the war, there were little 9-year-old kids in England that had never seen an orange and never seen a banana, because they were 3 years old when the war started, and when the war ended, they were 9 years old. So there were 9 and 10-year-old kids that had never, they had maybe seen a banana before they were completely 3 years old, but when they were 9 years old, they didn't remember. So the kid in England couldn't remember ever seeing a banana or an orange, or handling when he saw pictures of it. You know, and in those days, it's very difficult for people today to understand what it was like then, because today a kid, when I was a kid, my dad had a friend that used to visit us, and he could take 3 apples, but mostly 3 boiled eggs, because we had chickens and boiled eggs. With the visitors, a lot of them used to come just so they could get a feed of eggs. And we used to feed eggs. We had so many chickens, eggs were plentiful, and the neighbors couldn't afford to buy them all, so we had a glut of eggs. Same thing with the milk and the butter, because the neighbors were poor also. They couldn't afford to buy our milk, they couldn't afford to buy our butter. So we let the milk go sour, and when it got sour, then you put it on the side of the coal and wood stove where it's warm, not hot, you can put your hand on it, and that milk curdles. That's what curd's about. And that sour milk curdles. But present-day sour milk that's been pasteurized, you can't do this. This is fresh cow's milk. And we drank cow's milk, sour. Today it's like garbagey, it's mushy and everything if milk sours. But in those days, or now, if you take straight cow's milk and let it sour, it goes like jelly, like jello. And the cream is on the top, the sour cream. And if our cows were good cream cows, so we had a thick layer of sour cream on top of the sour milk. So the cream was scraped off, and that went into the butter churn. And the sour milk, we could take a cup and dip it into the sour milk like jelly and swill it down. And we enjoyed it. But today, you know, the pasteurized milk, when the milk sours in a paper carton, I can't hardly stand to walk past the carton. It smells so bad. And then, to make cottage cheese, you take that sour milk and you put it in a large, we had a large, sort of like a big dishpan, flat bottomed, and the sour milk would be sitting off in the corner of the stove. There was a kind of a ledge that stuck out, and that sour milk would curdle, and the liquid, kind of a yellowish shitty colored liquid, it would be in there. You've seen some kind of cheeses that they bring in, import, and there's a barrel and it's all sort of dirty, yellowish, piss-looking liquid, and inside they pick out with a scoop or something cheese, and the people, it's a delicacy, right? Have you seen that cheese, Chris? Mm-hmm. Okay, so the cottage cheese is the same way. So now they take this cottage cheese, and you take a pillowcase, but it's sewn in such a way, there's a cross sew on it, so the pillowcase has a point. Actually, they weren't pillowcases, but they were built something similar, with a fairly strong cloth. And the cheese from the bowl is poured into this cone-shaped cotton cloth, and the liquid, of course, runs out, so underneath there's a bowl to catch the liquid, and finally up here it's held on a broom handle type stick over there was a certain kind of bowl we had, high walls, so the stick this V cone with the cottage cheese in it was wrapped around and tied, and it would drip, 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 and overnight it would drip completely dry. So now we've got the cottage cheese dry in this wooden cone, or the cloth cone, and the whey, which is the milk, the liquid I mean, it's in the bowl in the bottom. So now we got nice cottage cheese. And the whey, that milk, or that watery part, I remember that we used to, it has a setting quality for hair. And we used to dip our comb in it and comb our hair on Sunday to go to church, so our hair would set. And it was just like a present day spray, women spraying her hair, the wind won't blow it. Well, that stuff from making the cottage cheese, that liquid, which was waste, but we wasted nothing, that then was mixed with bran, which is the chaff from wheat, and that was mixed with the bran, the chaff of wheat, and that fed the chickens. You know, nothing was wasted. Everything had a purpose. Or we had to capitalize on everything. So that wasn't way, but we would dip our combs in and comb our hair. And remember, even in our home, mirrors were at a premium.